Our guest for this program is Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. He's a native of Cameroon. He's the Regional Director of East Central and Africa at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Washington. He's also profiled as one who has been deeply involved in the strengthening and development of democracies in Africa since 1989. As a regional director, he's the principal liaison between the National Democratic Institute and the U.S. Department for State, the U.S. Department for International Affairs and International Development, and the U.S. embassies in East, Central, and West Africa. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, it's a great pleasure to have you on this program today.
Thanks for having me.
Quite a baggage of achievements you have. Is there any detail about your success I missed, perhaps?
Well, you know, most of the time it's interesting that other people look at what one has accomplished and pick out what they think is worthwhile. I'm just humbled to be here and feel fortunate to have the opportunity to work across the continent on issues pertaining to democracy and good governance.
What brings you to Cameroon at the beginning of the year? Well,
you know, home is home, and it doesn't matter, you know, where you are and what you do. It's always very important to once in a while come home to your roots and get a pulse of the state of the country and talk to your brothers and sisters and get a feel for how Cameroonians feel about their country and the future. Also, this is the youth month, I should say. We've just celebrated 11 February, which is the National Youth Day. And I thought it was important for me to come home as a mark of solidarity with the Cameroonian youth, to kind of be around with them, listen to them, and learn a lot about what the Cameroonian youth think about our country and its future.
For how long have you been out of the country?
Well, you know, I work for the National Democratic Institute, which is based in Washington, D.C., and so, you know, my family is there, but I'm constantly on the African continent because that's my area of focus. In fact, prior to being in Cameroon today, I was in Guinea-Conakry as that country is struggling to come out of a military coup. Then I visited Ivory Coast, where they're also dealing with a national reconciliation process. Then I went to Nigeria, where they're still dealing with the effects of the flawed elections of April 2007. And then I came over to Cameroon. And next month, I'll be in Tanzania, East Africa, and probably after that in South Africa to deal with issues pertaining to Zimbabwe. So I'm constantly on the African continent, and it's difficult to say when the last time was that I was home, because Africa is home to me.
Quite a tight agenda for you then.
It is, because our continent is going through some interesting moments. We've got countries that are doing well, that are success stories, such as Ghana, where we had elections in December and in January, Benin, Mali, Botswana, Mauritius. But we've also got other challenges, such as in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Chad, in Sudan, trouble spots where our organization tries to be helpful.
You are the regional director of the National Democratic Institute. What is that all about, the National Democratic Institute, the NDI?
Well, NDI is a non-governmental organization, a non-profit organization that was established in 1983 for the sole mission of promoting and supporting democracy worldwide. So it's been a full 25 years of existence. And basically, we work with political parties, civil society organizations, legislative bodies, such as the National Assembly, if we're in the case of Cameroon, or parliaments, trying to help the Democrats in these countries who are working on a daily basis for liberty and freedom and good governance. And so we come in to provide technical assistance and support and training and really play a support role, because I think that at the end of the day, the primary responsibility is for the Democrats in those countries to try to move the process forward. NDI has got programs in about 60 countries around the world. We represented in 60 countries. In Africa, we've got about 18 offices, but we also have offices in the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, the former Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe as well.
Okay. 6 years after the National Democratic Institute was created, you were made the regional director.
That's correct.
What has been the major role in Africa?
Well, you know, initially, my background is in law. I studied at the University of Yaoundé Law School. That was a long time ago, and had the benefits of good professors like Professor Ngango, Professor Tamak, Professor Melone, all laid as of date. And then I went to Harvard Law School. And so initially, I started off thinking I was going to go in the law profession. But then I got an opportunity to do a PhD in political science. And it was right at the time that the Berlin Wall was coming down and democratization was beginning to take root. And after that, finishing my PhD, I joined the National Democratic Institute. And I was privileged to be appointed very quickly, very early on in my career, to be the regional director for Africa. And my role is to help design, conceptualize NDI programs for Africa, to provide support to staff that's scattered all over the continent, that's working on African issues, and to provide some input as an African who is very familiar with the realities of our continent. And I think that explains why the National Democratic Institute has had such an impact across this continent, because we're very open to getting input from Africans themselves.
You talked about being very involved in countries like Ghana and Nigeria. Cameroon wasn't mentioned. What has been the impact of that non-governmental organization in Cameroon?
Well, you're right that Cameroon wasn't mentioned, but many Cameroonians will remember that NDI was involved in Cameroon in the period around the 1992 elections. And at the end of that electoral cycle, NDI produced a report and made a lot of recommendations, which NDI at the time thought that the government of Cameroon and the political leaders of Cameroon would embrace and discuss and find consensus on how to implement them. Unfortunately, there wasn't any positive feedback from Cameroon, and it became increasingly difficult for NDI to justify trying to put resources in a country where apparently its assistance wasn't being solicited. That's why since 1992, NDI hasn't had activities here in Cameroon. But we maintain a close watch over Cameroon, and I am in contact with a lot of the political leaders of the country, because ultimately I think that we all have to work together as Cameroonians, whether based in the country or in the diaspora. We all have to work together, with each individual making their contribution for the betterment of our country.
Let's talk a little bit about politics in Cameroon. A couple of weeks ago, we had the members of Electoral who took oath of office sometime around the 29th of January. What do you think about the makeup of that council?
I'm very aware that there's been some controversy about the makeup of the board of directors of Electoral. I know that it's come under a lot of criticism because of the partisan affiliation of some of those members. And I think those concerns are very legitimate, especially in an environment where the political process has been very polarized. And I think that, for example, if all of the members of the board had been from the opposition parties, that members of the ruling party would also have complained. So I think those complaints are very legitimate. Now that the institution is being put in place and individuals have been appointed to play the role of managing our elections, I think the onus, the burden is on those individuals to prove to the 18 million Cameroonians that they're worthy of our trust. And it's now up to them to really, in the performance of their duties, show that they deserve the trust of the Cameroonian people. Because ultimately, it's the 12 of them, including the management body, which is the Directorate General, that is going to run the elections of Cameroon. And it's on them that the responsibility is going to fall if Cameroon has credible elections or if it doesn't.
Any suggestions you would have made maybe if given the opportunity?
Well, it's true that if I had the opportunity of putting in place that kind of body, then my approach would have been very different. It would have been very consultative. There are dozens of Cameroonians, there are hundreds of Cameroonians who are viewed as independent, credible, impartial, many of whom may not have been involved in the political process up until this point, but who I'm sure, if called upon, would have been very willing, very committed to rendering service to their country as a civic responsibility. I have seen in the course of my work going across this continent a lot of independent election commissions that have been run by individuals who've come from academia, who've come from professional bodies, but who have been so committed to doing good service to their country that they've earned the respect of their fellow citizens. So I definitely would have taken a different approach, but here we have to deal with an institution that's already in place, with people that have been appointed, and the big question for all of us Cameroonians is, how can we move this process forward?
The swearing in of those members of the Electoral Council was done in the absence of a host of the diplomatic corps. that must have tempered with our international relations.
Well, I think the criticism that we saw on Elecam came not just from Cameroonians, it also came from our development partners, because these are partners who mean well for our country and who have also, over the years, seen that our electoral problem has been the subject of multiple complaints. And I think they had also hoped that all of the efforts that had been put in consultations leading up to the establishment of Elecam would have led to results that would be embraced by the entire political spectrum of Cameroon. So that disappointment is real and it's legitimate. Unfortunately, I wasn't here during that installation ceremony. I was aware of the fact that some of the development partners didn't show up, but I think it's also their prerogative to be able to express themselves, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the Cameroonian people need to know who is on their side and who is urging the government and the political leaders and policymakers to do the right thing for the people of Cameroon. And I think gestures like those do count.
Doctor, for a very long time, we have the opposition that has been doing its best, to unseat the president through, presidential elections and win majority in parliament. How do you appreciate the efforts that we're making?
Well, the context, I think every time you look at political parties and you look at opposition parties and ruling parties, you have to factor in the political context in which these political parties operate. In December, as I said, I was in Ghana. And I look at Ghana today. I worked in Ghana on the political process in Ghana going back to the 90s. I remember the 1992 elections in Ghana, 96. And I saw what Ghana has gone through. In 2000, they had a peaceful transition of power where Jerry Rawlings was term limited. He left office after serving 2 elective terms. His party lost the presidency and lost the parliament. President Kufuor, John Kufuor of the opposition party, won a majority in parliament and won the presidency and served 2 terms of 8 years. And in 2008, they had another election. He lost, the ruling party lost, the opposition parties won. And so that alternance, that political alternance through the electoral process is very healthy for Ghana. And that has really contributed to both the economic and political development of Ghana and the advances that Ghana has made in recent years. So when I look at that, I say that in an environment where there is consensus around the major political themes of a country, where parties play by the rules and where all parties have equal access to public media and the ability to be able to campaign across the country, to be able to organize themselves without any kind of harassment, then we really have the opportunity to nurture parties that are viable and that can compete in the political process. And so that this alternation of power is a very healthy process even for political parties. Without that kind of context, it becomes difficult to say whether political parties, opposition parties are weak solely because their leaders are unable to organize themselves, or whether they're weak because the political context doesn't allow them to organize themselves. And I think that's a fundamental step that we haven't yet crossed here in Cameroon.
Dr. Christopher, let's talk about you now, your political life. Some years back, it was rumored that you were very interested, to be a presidential candidate. Is that true?
I like the way you preface the question by saying some years it was rumored. And I remember, a Cameroonian who said, don't believe all the rumors you hear. But invariably, I have to say this, that the Cameroonians of my generation, and there are many of them who've stayed in the country and who are very active in opposition parties as well as in the ruling parties. Many of my classmates today are either in government or leading the opposition in parliament or in the parties. And so I think it's a natural trend of events that at some point, one generation needs to prepare itself to be able to move the country from where the previous generation left it to higher heights. And also that as you work on these issues having to deal with good governance and the promotion and support of democratic institutions, ultimately you're going to have to come to a point where you want to be able to make your modest contribution to the development of your country. And for me, it's not about me and what I want to do. It's more about what I can contribute to Cameroon. And that's really the kind of message that I try to put across when I meet with political leaders, our own Cameroonian political leaders, that it's really not about you and what you want. It's about what you can bring to this country, this worthy country of ours, and what you can do to improve the well-being of fellow Cameroonians.
Doctor, still about your political life and political interest. Do you still have the intention of maybe coming back to Cameroon to be fully involved in the political life of this country, maybe getting the membership in a party?
Obviously, home is home, as they say. I know that no matter what I do for the African continent, ultimately, at some point, I owe it to my own country to be able to find a way to make a contribution. The question of my political affiliation may still be premature, but ultimately, if I'm going to have to get involved in the political process, first I'm going to have to resign from NDI because we're a non-partisan organization. And if it means that I play a more political role after that resignation, then ultimately I'm going to have to come back and, like everyone else, make my views known and my affiliation known, and use that opportunity to make my modest contribution as a citizen of this country and one that loves dearly his fatherland.
Are you thinking about it seriously?
At my age, with the work that I do across this continent, having worked on democratization and good governance for close to 2 decades, and seeing where Cameroon is today, there is no doubt that issues like that have to bother me and cross my mind, not because of me, but more in terms of what it is that I could contribute to my own country. I don't think that, I know, and I hear this from classmates and schoolmates, and every Cameroonian is expected to make a contribution to his or her country. And I think that ultimately, at some point, the Cameroonian people are going to have to hold my feet to the fire and would say to me, what have you done for your country? I want to be able to respond to that question when I'm still strong and able-bodied and talented enough to make a contribution. I wouldn't want to respond to that question when I'm retired and tired and out of energy.
Doctor, you've been in Ghana, where their democracy is envied by most Africans. What is the secret of your success?
I think the secret of the success of Ghana, I would see both positive incentives as well as negative experiences. On the positive side, I think in Ghana today, there's a political will that exists at the topmost level of the country to say our country has gone through so much and we can't allow it to go down the wrong path anymore. And so while parties compete, and sometimes very rigorously, there's an understanding of the essentials of national interest, to say there are certain boundaries that we can't cross because we want to give every Ghanaian a fair chance. We want to give every Ghanaian a sense that they belong to that society and can make a contribution. That's for the positive experience. On the negative side, I think that Ghana also went through some very rough moments in the 80s and in the early 90s. And I think most Ghanaians remember that their country was on the brink. And in some ways, would want to do everything to not get through that point. And so when you go through a country that's experiencing crisis, whether the economic or political crisis, your hope, and it's a constant hope for me, and I'm sure for millions of Cameroonians, is that someday we will be able to look back at our difficult times and draw some lessons that would make us all want to contribute to a better Cameroon.
What is the short-term process we need to take to get there? What has to be done now?
Yeah.
For Cameroon, the case of Cameroon, our country.
Yeah. Sure. I think we do have a number of important benchmarks ahead of us as a country, and in terms of the political calendar of Cameroon. Because ultimately, as a Democrat, as somebody who believes in the democratic process, change comes about through the electoral process, through the ballot box. And it's by massive participation in that electoral process that citizens can bring about change in their countries. We've seen what is happening in this continent in the last 2 decades. 20 years ago, for example, all of Africa was ruled either by the military or by one-party rule. Today, multi-parties exist across the African continent. It's because Africans stood up and said we wanted to be governed differently. So I think in the short to medium term, Cameroonians are going to have to make the decision of saying we want to be governed differently, and we're going to express ourselves through an electoral process, because that's the process that works in every democratic society. And I think until our leaders hear from the Cameroonians, from the citizens, there's probably going to be no incentive for them to want to perform better or for them to want to change some of the ways that people are critical of in terms of how the country is governed.
The long-term measures.
The long-term measures, obviously, you can make democracy without Democrats. And my hope is that at some point, some of the issues that may be entrenched in our society or in our institutions that inhibit the ability for more transparency and more accountability in the management of public resources, that some of those things would have to be weeded out, that we may have to undertake reforms in the economic sector, for example, to encourage private sector investment, to create an enabling environment. When I move around the continent or I read in newspapers, the ratings that Cameroon has in terms of the business environment, I feel that doesn't encourage private investors to want to come to Cameroon, because if we're rated poorly, then we don't attract private investors. We have to undertake reforms in the economic sector to be able to do that. We also have to undertake a lot of political reforms, because I would love to see a Cameroon where decisions are made through a very consultative and open process. I would like to see less people appointed by decrees, but more people elected by their citizens. There is no reason why we should elect mayors and then have government delegates appointed by decree to oversee the mayors, because then you undercut the mayors who have a mandate from the citizens. Ultimately, we'll get to the point where I would like to see governors of regions elected by the people of that region, because then they have a mandate from the people and they have a responsibility to make sure that the development of the region matches the priorities of the citizens. So there are a whole series of reforms that one could put in place, but ultimately, you have to be in a position where your voice is heard and your opinions are taken into consideration, or where you ultimately influence and impact on those kinds of reforms.
Doctor, in 2 years, we'll be having the presidential elections in Cameroon. As someone who has been monitoring the political life of this country, how do you see 2011?
Well, 2.5 years or 3 years, because it's going to be the end of 2011. It's a long time in politics. It's a lifeline in politics. Anything can happen. 6 months, it's a lifetime in politics. It's like basketball. 2 minutes in a basketball game is a lifetime, because anything can happen. But my hope is that despite the controversies about Electoral, that Cameroonians are going to take the opportunity to register, to make their voices heard. Because ultimately, to be able to impact on an electoral process, you have to be a registered voter. If you deprive yourself of the ability to impact the process by not registering to vote, then ultimately, come 2011, it doesn't matter how you feel, your voice is not going to get heard. Now, if there are things that Cameroonians believe need to be corrected, the only way they're going to get those corrections is to register in the electoral process, and then at the right time, come out and have their voices heard. So I think we have an opportunity, we have a window between now and 2011 to make sure that the Cameroonian people can regain confidence in the electoral process. Because the danger that I fear for our country is that we get to the point where citizens have developed such apathy towards the electoral process that they opt out of the system and they feel that they have no stake in the system. Because then the message that you send to 18 million Cameroonians is that change cannot come about through the electoral process. And as a committed Democrat, that's a message that I don't want Cameroonians to hear. So I would say people should be prepared to participate in the elections. People should register to make their voices heard. And ultimately, when we get to 2011, they would want to have their voices heard, and the people would have to decide.
Let's move a little bit away from Cameroon and talk more about the African Union. We have the 12th summit of the African Union that took place in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, where the United States of Africa was a major idea that was championed by the chairman, the Libyan president, Muammar Gaddafi. United States of Africa, is that possible?
The United States of Africa is possible. We can wish for it. But I think there's a lot of work to be done. You cannot decree a United States of Africa. I'm a Cameroonian, and I travel with a Cameroon passport. Can you imagine how difficult it is for me to get visas in other African countries with my Cameroonian passport?
Even in the sub-region?
Even in the sub-region. I traveled yesterday from Nigeria to Cameroon, and the plane was full of Cameroonians who had gone to Nigeria to get visas to go to other African countries. Is that acceptable? Not at all. Can we trade across the continent? How easy is this for a businessman from Bafusam or even from Ebolova to transport his or her goods into Gabon, into Congo-Brazzaville, into Bangui, and to sell them freely on the open market. You know, there are a lot of barriers to mutual economic transactions across the African continent that sitting on the high table in Addis and decreeing a United States of Africa wouldn't make sense. Look at Colonel Gaddafi. I know he's contributed somewhat to the African continent, but when he comes out and says, you know, multipartyism is not African and democracy is not African because in Africa political parties are tribes, I take personal offense, because which Africa are we talking about? Are we talking about the Africa of Benin or Mali or South Africa or Botswana or Mauritius that are vibrant democracies? Or are we talking about the Africa of Libya that doesn't have political parties, or of other countries that are being ruled in an autocratic fashion? So I think the African people at the grassroots level aspire for more unity amongst themselves, for better communications across the continent. And there's a lot of synergy to be built across Africa, both in economic as well as in political terms. But our leaders, our African leaders, need to do a lot more to be responsive to their people so that the emergence of a United States of Africa comes about as a natural evolution, as an organic process that has come from within the continent, rather than stand on the high pulpit and preach the United States of Africa, but at the same time put in place impediments that make it extremely difficult for Africans to communicate amongst themselves and to be able to do transactions, economic and other transactions across the continent.
If you have to begin at a level of, gradual integration, sub-region by sub-region, that might be a possibility.
That may be a possibility. And to the credit of the sub-regional entities, whether you're talking about ECOWAS in West Africa, SADC in Southern Africa, CEMAC, or ISAC for the Central Africa region, or IGAD in East Africa and the Horn, or the Maghrebian Association, those regional bodies are working well. And I think that's a good start. I know that some are working faster than others. A lot of my compatriots, Cameroonians, will tell you that ECOWAS is working better than CEMAC. We would hope that, we would wish that the Central African region was better performing. But these sub-regional organizations are beginning to do a lot to foster greater economic integration amongst their people. And I think that may be a good way to continue to build on this concept of providing broader space for Africans to be able to interact, both on a commercial, on a social, and a cultural basis.
This idea of the United States of Africa, it appears it instead, brings more division among member states. Don't you think so? Well,
it's an old-age dispute going back to 1963 when the Organization of African Unity was launched. There were African leaders who, like Kwame Nkrumah, who talked about Pan-Africanism, and they saw, already at that time, they saw a United States of Africa in the making. But then there were other leaders, such as Fomunyoh of Ivory Coast, who were very stuck to the concept of sovereignty. It makes a lot of sense to create broader space for economic transactions, because in the competitive world of today, in the 21st century, a number of our countries are not viable entities all by themselves. They can't compete in today's global village, as we say. And so the concept by itself of creating larger entities, regional bodies or sub-regional bodies, it's a good idea by itself and deserving of praise. But at the same time, there are impediments that need to be cleared. There are tensions amongst countries or between countries that need to be dealt with. There are border issues between Ethiopia and Eritrea, for example, that need to be sorted out. There are tensions between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo that need to be dealt with. But increasingly, the commitment ultimately is going to come down to making sure we have comparable governance systems. For example, if we got to the point where all of our African countries had the same democratic values, then, and facilities exist for citizens to interact across national boundaries, then it becomes a natural, it becomes a natural issue. You don't even have to decree it, because I could go from one country to the other, and a businessman could get their goods from one country to the other. We may even look at the issue of currencies and facilitate currency exchange. A Cameroonian who comes from Nigeria with a lot of naira has nothing to do with them. Just as, if you go from Cameroon with your CFA into the Democratic Republic of Congo, you have nothing to do with them besides going through the banks. So I think there's a lot of work to be to do. The idea itself is a noble cause.
The incumbent president of the African Union is the Libyan president, Muammar Gaddafi. What do you think about his rule or his person as a president of the African Union?
You know, the electoral framework of the African Union calls for a rotational chairmanship. And so the chairmanship has to rotate amongst the sub-regions. And because SADC had the chairmanship with President Kikwete of Tanzania, it was now the turn of North Africa to produce a chairman. It so happened that in Addis, Colonel Gaddafi was the only president from the Northern Africa region, and he submitted his candidacy. And so I think the African Union had no choice but to give him the chairmanship. At the same time, I think we must all acknowledge that Africa has evolved. And unfortunately, some of the leaders that have been in power for decades may not be aware of the fact that the continent has evolved. And so there's part of Gaddafi that has broad views for the continent and sometimes expresses them very outlandishly. But there are other parts of Gaddafi that reflect an Africa that the Africans of today don't relate to, that the Africans of your generation, of my generation, don't relate to. And I think the challenge for the African Union is going to be for the next 12 months to make sure that when Gaddafi speaks for himself, he makes a distinction between what he says for himself and what he says on behalf of the African Union. I understand that at the heads of states meeting in Addis, there was some effort to make sure that in the next meeting when he goes out to represent the African continent, I think with the upcoming G8 meeting or some international meeting, that he would have 2 other African leaders with him so that they could speak as a troika of sort to kind of harmonize the message that we want to send to the world. Because the world itself is changing. The world wants to engage Africa differently, and I think the world is eager to have African interlocutors that represent the Africa of the 21st century.
6 days after he was made president of the African Union, he was interviewed by journalists, and he said, coups are better, coups are good, as long as they are staged peacefully. In reaction to this interview, some African newspaper wrote that under Gaddafi, Africa could explode. What is your take on that?
Well, you know, there's a saying that if the only toolbox you have is a hammer, you're tempted to see every problem as a nail. And I think that many of us are the victims of our own experiences. And so if you have someone who came into power through a coup and who's ruled with an iron fist as a military leader, he couldn't speak about anything else because in his entire life, he's not known anything better. But I think most Africans will disagree with that assertion. And the proof is that, as I just said, the continent has made tremendous progress in terms of democratic governance. And I think that's the wave of the future.
In a couple of minutes, we'll be closing this program. Let's talk about you. You recently launched a foundation, isn't it?
Well, interestingly, the Fomunyoh Foundation exists. It will be close to 10 years. The Fomunyoh Foundation was actually launched in 1999 as my own small effort, a very modest effort, you know, to try to give back to my community. Because when I look back at my own life, I'm from very humble beginnings. My parents are not wealthy. My parents were farmers. They're still farmers. But I was very lucky that as I went through secondary school and high school and the university, I got a lot of help from other people. And while I may have then gone overseas and studied and I'm working, I felt that it was important for me to make a gesture in my own country. And that's why I launched the foundation, to try to support humanitarian actions, women's organizations, traditional rulers and in villages, even the media, and even in areas of education and civic education, to try to make my own modest contribution to an improvement in the well-being of the people of Cameroon. So the Fomunyoh Foundation does exist. It has a head office in Bamenda. And I think ultimately the idea is to expand it across the country so that with friends and family and other well-wishers, we can find a way to give back to our communities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh is the Regional Director for East, Central, and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Washington. It was a great pleasure having you on this program.
Thank you for having me, and keep up the good work.
Goodbye.
Thank you.